Welcome to the Third Decade Podcast, where we believe every young adult deserves the confidence to take control of their financial future. Whether you're just getting started or you're well on your way towards financial independence, we're here to give you the tools and guidance you need to build a life that aligns with your dreams. Let's turn financial uncertainty into opportunity. Together.
Hi, Third Decade community. I'm your host, Nikita Wolf, and today I am joined by volunteer financial mentor, Adam Van Deusen. Thanks for joining us, Adam.
Hi, Nikita. Glad to be here.
So I'm excited for today's topic because we see this come up a lot for couples in our program, and I guess alumni, obviously, as well, who have a change in circumstances and maybe have a long-term partner who they're wondering how they should merge finances. So really what I want to talk about is how and when and what our options are for merging finances as a couple. So as we all know, money is one of those top predictors of issues in relationships. And I think there are lots of things that we can get ahead of on that front. So I wanted to talk today. Adam has really interesting perspectives on different options for this. So I'm excited for this conversation. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the different ways that couples handle money, maybe some of the pros and cons of each of those, and just communication tips and questions to ask before you actually, pull the trigger and merge finances in whatever way feels right for you or don't. So let's start with the big question. Adam, what should we do? Do we combine finances or do we not?
Yeah, as you said, it's a big issue in relationships. If you're, maybe you just got engaged or you're moving in together or got married, there's so much going on. And then there's this big money question. And, what happens sometimes is that sometimes people just end up in a default option. It's like, this is what we were doing and we just do it. Or in the beginning, we just did it this way without thinking about it. And that's what happened. And I think if found, at least anecdotally in my experience, and I think there's some research to back this up, that's often can create challenges, and that taking a more intentional approach to having active discussions with your partner and making decisions that make the most sense for your particular situation often lead to the best results. And we can sort of get into maybe the process of how you might go about doing that.
Yeah, something also that I've experienced firsthand, but also I'm sure it depends for other people, is the age in which you get married or that you merge finances with somebody might make a big difference. Because I think maybe a 20-year-old who is getting married really young, I was 21 when I got married to my husband. Thankfully, things are still going great. So, we maybe aren't part of the typical statistic about really early marriages. But when you're 20 and you're getting married, you might not really have much in the first place. So it doesn't feel like you're letting go of anything to default into a fully combined situation. However, when you're 35 or 55 or, much further down the line and you have a career and you have assets and you have a house and stuff like that, I know I would feel a lot more protective, I think, if I was having to start from scratch where I'm at and thinking about merging with somebody. So I'm sure some of that impacts the merging process as well and how people feel going into a relationship and whether or not they want to merge things.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we'll talk about today, there really isn't one right answer for everyone. We'll talk about some of the research that suggests one thing or another, but depending on your stage of life, depending on, things you've experienced. So, for example, someone who had previously been in a relationship that was maybe someone had taken advantage of them, taken their money, they might be much more likely to want to keep their finances separate in a subsequent relationship, whereas someone who hadn't gone through that might be much more willing, and that could totally work for both groups. So we'll talk about some of the different structures and options and things, but I think just by thinking about these issues and having the conversation both internally and with your partner is really a great first step and can get you on the right track for whatever that means to you.
Yeah. So let's talk about maybe some of our options. What are the main approaches that you could take?
Yeah, so there's a few different ideas. So some people might think of having their finances be completely joint as much as possible. So this would be though taking a step back, actually, I should say there's sort of two ways to approach this. So oftentimes when it's discussed in the media or elsewhere, it's talked about, well, sort of how do we handle our money physically? Do we have a joint checking account that we spend from? Do we have separate accounts, and so on and so on? But I actually think it's worth taking one step back from there and thinking, as I was saying, sort of psychologically of how you want to treat your money. So you and your partner, do you, and you each can answer on your own and then have a discussion, is do you want to think of your money as a partnership as psychologically your money together, or your money as separate individuals? So for example, no matter what kind of accounts you use, if you think of your money as a whole psychologically, that my money is yours in the opposite way, for example, it might not matter where the money for the rent payment or the groceries come from, because it's a whole pot of our money. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the other way, if you think of your money as separate, then that's going to create different circumstances. So now, yeah, you might need to find a way to fairly divide up the different expenses, because you're thinking of the money that's coming into me is mine and that's yours, but we are going to share some expenses. So I would really encourage folks to think of, if you're sort of entering this situation, to think to yourself first, well, do I want to have this as a shared pool of money, or do we want to keep things separate, even if we have maybe a combined bank account that we put some money in? I think that's a really good first step.
Yeah, and taking that a step further, you might have feelings one way or another on how you view it psychologically, but you want to make sure your partner is in alignment with that too. Because if one of you views it as fully combined and the other one views it as separate, like, you're gonna come up against some roadblocks. I'd say probably pretty quickly. So having that open discussion early on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and then once you've had that discussion, so then you can sort of get to the next level as well. How do we want to manage our money? I say sort of physically, but in terms of the accounts, where payments come from, items like that. So, for example, at one level, you might have fully joint and combined as much as possible. So you'll open, let's say, a joint checking account for the two of you, and all of your money goes into that account. So my paycheck, your paycheck, anything else that comes in is all going into that joint account. And then we'll just pay all of our expenses from that account. We'll pay our mortgage from it, our rent, our groceries, whatever it is, comes from that account. Maybe you have joint credit cards. You can both be on the same credit card account, or separately. You could have a joint investment account or savings account. All of these things can all be joint. It's worth noting that there are certain accounts that are only individuals. So most of your retirement accounts are only in your name. So IRA stands for Individual Retirement Account. So that will be an only one. So I might have an IRA, my partner might have another IRA. And so you can have the discussion of, how much you want to contribute to each. Maybe you move the same amount of money from the joint checking account to each IRA, if you're making contributions to that. But in this way is putting all your money in sort of this one pot and working from there. But with that, and maybe we can get into this, or there's some sort of upsides and downsides of doing it that way.
Yeah, I think something I'd really like to touch on, whether it's now or later in the episode, is ways that you can protect yourself against potentially, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, financial abuse at the end of the day. And I see this happen, unfortunately, a lot with women. I love advocating for women's involvement in their finances. I think so much of the time, especially historically, like my grandmother, she would never think about being the one in her household to be taking care of the finances. It's always been my grandpa. And that has been very normal for a very long time. But we also see the ways that has really hurt people in the long term and hurt retirement. So you already kind of mentioned it, but I had a friend specifically who is in a great relationship, and they were contributing towards an IRA. And then I was like, I don't think you guys aren't going to work out, but I think it's just a great idea. If you guys are looking at that as us money, just split it down the middle and each of you contribute to your own IRA, because we don't always know what's going to happen if, in the event of a separation, how assets get divided up, but you want to make sure that both of you have income. And yeah, that's my little tangent for a moment, but
yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think we'll talk about that in sort of the next style is maybe being almost entirely joint, but then having your own separate account, like a separate checking account. And then we'll get into maybe how you move money to and from, because you do want to make sure, even if it's only in your name, that you're being open about that. So one of the more common things term often used is financial infidelity, is you have a secret savings account that your partner doesn't know about. In which case, especially if you're treating things jointly, that's money that you could be using for something, but you're sort of keeping it to yourself. But being open and saying, hey, I'm going to keep a separate savings account for myself. I want $5,000 just in case something happens. I want money that's in my name only. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And being open with it makes a lot of sense that way.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to touch on the next option for combining or not combining finances?
Yeah, well, maybe we can get into some of the pros and cons of the joint side, maybe as people are thinking about it.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Why is on the mind? So having the joint account is actually one of the things that sort of has some research backing. So there have been surveys over the years that ask people, how do you keep your finances, joint, separate, et cetera, and then how happy are you in your relationship? So all of these surveys pretty much found the same thing, that people who are more likely to have, people with joint accounts were more likely to be happy in their relationship. But this is a prime case of, you say, correlation versus causation. The idea that while these two things are related to each other, it's not necessarily that one is causing the other. So you might imagine that people who, it's not just that you have a joint account that's causing the marital happiness or happiness in a partnership, but perhaps it's another factor. Perhaps you both are very trusting of each other, and that's why you got the joint account in the first place, is because you both trusted each other, and that trust is a very good sign for your relationship. So there's other factors that could be involved. So some other researchers did a really interesting study. This was pretty recent, where they took people who had just were entering this phase. They were either getting married or engaged, moving in together, whatever it was. And they separated them into 3 different groups, and they told them what to do. So they told one group, you all open up a joint checking account, keep everything joint. They told another group, keep everything separate. Your own separate accounts, you can each contribute to the rent, whatever it is, but keep everything separate. And then the third group, they didn't give any instructions. They said, you can just do whatever you want. And so they tracked them over time to see what happened. And it turns out they found that there was actually a relationship between the couples who were treating their finances jointly with happiness down the line, satisfaction with their relationship. So that was a really interesting finding, because it took out, because they were randomized into the different groups, it took out some of those sort of confounding factors that could have also played into this relationship. So that's an interesting finding, but at the same time, there's potential downsides of this joint, being very, very joint with your finances. One is, again, you're putting a lot of trust into the other person here. If you're putting all your money in one pot, you both have access to it, could pull the money out, do something with it that you don't want the other one to do. So that's a big element. Another thing that can happen here too is when both money is in one pot, let's say, it can be tempting to sort of nitpick the other on their spending, right? This is our pot of money that we have. Why did you spend $50 on this, $100 on that? Like, no, we need to cut this and that. So if you're going to do it that way, it can help to have a very specific plan for how you want to handle, who's tracking what expenses and as it goes along. So for example, for some couples, the way it works is, let's say you work out your monthly expenses and you see, okay, we have enough room where, let's say each of us can have $100 of, guilt-free spending money. So each month, you each get $100 out of that, the joint pot, and you can spend it on whatever, no judgment from the other person. So, I have my things that I want. My wife has the things that she wants. We don't judge each other. So that's one way to sort of get around that hiccup. But, being joint requires a lot of trust and a lot of communication to make sure that it's still working for both partners.
Yeah, definitely. I think you pretty much covered the things I was going to say about that as well. My husband and I have kind of touched on a few different methods because, as I said, we got married really young. So we kind of reached this point where, exactly like what you said, I think it was my husband maybe was the first to experience this feeling of like, well, I don't like feeling like I have to ask to,
Right.
buy a video game that's maybe going to be $75.
Right.
Where at that point, we were in college and I'm like, I feel like we're broke. Why are we spending money on this? But he's like, but this is how I want to spend money. This is like what brings value to my life. And so kind of figuring out like ways to creatively have money in separate accounts that like the way that we've structurally set it up is that like we have our own savings with a pool of money that, we have for each of us. And if there's an expense that we're not in agreement on with each other, basically we can just kind of override, be like, great, well, I'm going to use the money that's in my account for that then. And then anytime, if we need to shuffle money into those accounts periodically throughout the year, if we've got maybe a surplus of money and we want to kind of hit reset and maybe send $400 to each of our accounts again, or both of us independently have some side endeavors that we can make extra money on, we can buff up those accounts that way. So this has evolved over the years, but yeah, just another idea throwing out there of a way that I've charted that territory too.
Yeah, I think that's great. And sort of a related idea too is sometimes you might set a limit of, ask free spending. So if it's under $20, like you don't have to ask the other person, as their income or whatever goes up, maybe that goes up to 50 or 100 or something beyond. But that way, again, you said, you're like, oh, I'm getting this candy bar. Do I need to like text my partner to see if it's okay?
What a nightmare. Can you imagine?
Yeah. So that's something that might work for you as well, depending on your situation.
Yeah. So are we ready maybe to talk about the other options we have for combining or not combining?
Yeah.
Great.
So maybe a middle ground here. So let's say you don't want to be fully joint in that way. So another way might be is you keep separate accounts. So you have your own checking account, you have your own savings account, and so does your partner. And then you have a joint account sort of in the middle. So maybe you can, there's a couple of ways to do that. So you could either each contribute a certain amount of money into the joint account that's used for your expenses or things, or you could just put your paychecks into the joint account and then sort of take some out for each of your own spending. This sounds similar to, it sounds like what you do, Nikita, which is having money in the middle and then pulling money out, either certain amounts at certain intervals, and then use that for your own spending. So in this case, it's nice. You have this sort of joint pot of money. You're still experiencing that jointness, but you also then have some freedom and flexibility on your own of the money that's sort of only in your name. It sounds like, is that sort of what you do? And has that worked for you?
That one is we did do that at a certain point, but that's not currently where we're at. I do want to ask the question though, because I think this is a great opportunity to ask this: equal versus equitable split. If we have a partner who maybe makes $100K just themselves and the other partner makes $45K, it doesn't necessarily feel very fair. Let's say their monthly expenses total $4,000 a month. $2,000 a person impacts them very differently to contribute into that joint account. So what might you suggest for somebody in that situation or some version of that situation to have more of an equitable approach rather than an equal approach?
Yeah. A couple of great points come off of this. So one is the idea that, and this is again, to have this conversation up front before any animosity or issues build up. Just as you were saying, if you have very unequal incomes and you're trying to split up the expenses, as you said, if your rent's $2,000, the $1,000 for the one person means less than the $1,000 for the other person. And so maybe you do it on a percentage basis. So if I make, 60% of the income and my partner makes 40%, maybe I pay 60% of the rent and 40% of the rent. Though another issue this brings up, though, is going back to that issue of psychological jointness versus separateness. So the way we're talking about right now, this would be in the case of if you think of your money as separate from each other. So this is my money and your money. And because our money's separate, we need to think of a way that we're splitting all of these bills up, whether it's equally, or maybe if our incomes are equal, or equitably if our incomes are far apart. Now, if you are in the case, you could have this style of account, sort of one joint account and one's in your own, and also psychologically think of your money as joint. So you put all your money in the middle, and then you send a couple $100 to each of your separate accounts for sort of your own spending, as it were, and then everything just gets paid out of that middle account. But it doesn't matter if I pay this bill or you pay that bill, because we think of the big pot of money as the same. So this is where these two concepts of like the psychological jointness versus like the physical jointness intersect and interact.
Yeah. So how about that? Maybe I'm sure there's more than three options, but we'll call it a third option of just not keeping everything completely separate. Like I know I've had friends that I like see Venmo transactions for like that week's groceries. Could we talk maybe about that option and maybe pros and cons of it?
Yeah. So in this case, you say you have no joint accounts at all. And in this case, you're very likely thinking of your money as psychologically separate as well. But so in this case, this is where you're going to have some joint expenses. So you're going to want to have these conversations we were talking about of who's paying what. Maybe you see all your bills and it comes out that, let's say, go back, one person is 60% of the income, one person's 40. So if they pay for the rent and groceries, that's 60% of the expenses. And then I'll pay for the, housing expenses and our pet expenses and whatever it is. And that's 40%. So I'll pay those bills from my accounts and you pay those bills from your accounts. So in terms of the positives of this way, it gives you full independence. Your income that you're earning from your job is going into your account. You're spending it. You're going to owe your communal expenses, and then you spend whatever you want out of it. They're not seeing what you're spending on. You don't have to worry about transferring money out of the account every month or them picking on the limits of how much you're spending. Though the downsides is this can take it takes maintenance to do, let's say, as your income every month or every year, as your income changes and your expenses change, are you then adjusting who's putting, what percentage in? You might do that to make sure it still feels fair. And then, perhaps more qualitatively, and I think this was sort of the finding from the study I mentioned earlier, is when you're in this situation, it might feel less joint, right? That you're almost back in this roommate situation where you have sort of co-expenses maybe that you're splitting up, as opposed to a long-term relationship where you're sort of in it together. But again, there are many reasons why you might do this. I think you'll see this a lot with second marriages before, where they might have gone through, had an experience where money was taken out of joint accounts, or as you're saying, like a financially abusive situation. I think that's a possible thing that people could see. So definitely pros and cons to doing it that way as well.
I think it's also worth saying here that I think whether or not a couple has children can greatly impact maybe even the feasibility of that third option, especially. Like, I can't imagine having our twin babies right now and like Venmoing my husband for like the diapers. like how do you even, I don't know. Like, you have to be combined at a certain point. I'd say at least partially combined once you have kids, or I don't know how you would make that work. I feel like it would be so laborious to keep things separated and truly fair.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And again, as your different expenses, it's one thing if you're just splitting the rent, but now if you're splitting groceries and everything else, that's it's going to be a little bit harder to maintain. But for some people, that might be worth it.
Mm-hmm. So I know money talks can be a really beneficial thing for people. It also, I think, depending on the person, maybe can feel a little intimidating. Could you maybe outline for us like how to have a good money conversation, different approaches for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so first off, just being interested in having the conversation, you've taken a big first step, because a lot of couples have gone a long time without even talking about money. Like I said, they just sort of defaulted into something and that's what they do. And then one day, one of the partners is like, I have no idea where our money is. Or, I don't know how much is coming into our account every month. So by having the conversation and being open with your partner, I think is a good practice. So I think to start out with, it might be a good idea if you can share and feel comfortable with each other, sharing your experiences with money in the past. What was your background growing up? Did your family have an abundance of money? Did they have a shortage of money? And how has that impacted your attitudes towards money today? You hear stories of people who grew up during the Great Depression that for decades and decades after, that left scars on them financially, that they didn't, even if they had significant wealth, they still didn't want to spend for fear that something like that might happen again. So you can imagine a variety of situations your partner might be coming from. And I think that's not only good to get that in the open for conversation purposes, but also will help you empathize with them. to know where they're coming from. So, when you're having an argument over something like, I want to spend on this, but they don't want to spend on that. Well, it's not because they're trying to hold me down or they don't respect my interests. Maybe it's because, again, they had a situation where their money was so tight and they didn't have enough to eat at some point in their childhood, and they don't want that to happen again. I think it can help you be more understanding of each other. So I think that's a good first step.
When do you think is good to start these conversations within a relationship? You might not have the conversation on your first date, but within the relationship, when do you feel like that becomes appropriate?
Yeah. So, putting my financial planner hat on, it might be as soon as you feel comfortable too, because money is such a big thing that goes on. Again, you're not laying out your, checking account and investment account balances on the table at your first date, as you said. But at times of transition, if you're thinking of moving in together or before getting engaged or hopefully almost certainly before getting married, those can be good occasions to check in. And it can be in stages. Perhaps earlier on in your relationship, you're talking more qualitatively about money. Do each of you, am I a saver or a spender? What are some of my financial goals? Maybe you're in sync. Maybe you both have a goal to achieve early retirement, or to be able to live in another country or whatever it is. Those are good things to explore, because you might find your goals are on totally different wavelengths. And if they are, that's probably something to work through. And then maybe as you get more serious, maybe you're considering getting engaged, maybe that's when you put the numbers on the table. Say, hey, here's what I have in checking, here's what my student loan balance is, everything else going on. And that way you're being open with each other and knowing what each of you are getting into. And it's probably going to depend on the couple at the time you feel most comfortable doing that. But I think in general, by the time you're ready to get engaged, married, you should have hopefully have a really good sense both of, your partner's money values, as well as your values, goals, as well as exactly what their situation looks like, both separately and together, because that might inform, again, how you decide to, handle your finances, the level of jointness or separateness of it.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all really great points. I know I've also heard of the concept of a money date. Mm-hmm. Do you recommend a specific cadence of that? What that can look like? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And again, I would say it's going to vary by couple. For my wife and I, we do this once every quarter. So once every 3 months, we check in, we look at the status of our accounts to make sure we have enough in our respective checking accounts, looking at some account balances, as well as we're checking in on our spending. So use one of the budget tracking apps so we can see, was our spending this quarter sort of in line with our goal that we might have set at the beginning of the year. Now, you could do this monthly. Maybe if you're just so we've been doing this for many, many years, so the quarterly works for us. But as you're just getting started out, maybe you start checking in every month or so, just to keep that communication going. I think the key is to find a way that you can commit to doing it regularly. So once a month, once a quarter, because if you start skipping it, then you might forget, and then it kind of might spiral downhill from there. So whatever works for you. But when you do this, I would encourage you to do things that make it a more enjoyable experience. So there's some people who just love talking about money, and there's some people who really don't like talking about money. And I find often in partners, there's one of one and one of the other. So one might be excited to talk and maybe not the other one. So in that case, try to find a way to make it enjoyable. So for example, be sure to share your financial wins. Like, look, we exceeded our savings rate for this month. We're doing great towards this financial goal. Also, try to pair the sort of money date with an enjoyable activity. Do it right before you go out to dinner, or a date for the night. That way, or do it over a bottle of wine. Some people like doing it that way, or beer, or whatever, or just a nice meal at home, whatever it is that you really enjoy. So it's not seen as necessarily a psychological chore, but something that can be enjoyed and sort of nurtures the conversation between you.
Definitely. And if you do find that one partner is very, like you said, it's usually one and one. It's mm-hmm. I've seen, and I listened to Ramit Sethi's podcast, and mm-hmm. I think we'll talk about him a little bit later, but oftentimes he talks about how one person might just railroad a conversation and mm-hmm. really dominate that space. What are some approaches, soft skills, maybe to bring into a conversation about money if you're maybe not necessarily the same money personality?
Yeah, it's a good point. Oftentimes you might refer to it that one person is just the household CFO, as it were, the household chief financial officer, and the other one isn't. There's probably some couples where both people are really into money, but as you said, there might be one or the other. And so I think the responsibility is on both sides in this case. So if you're the CFO, maybe you have your spreadsheets that you really like and things like that. And maybe your partner doesn't want to dig in the spreadsheets, but it can help to be open with them. Here's what our financial situation is. Maybe they don't want to get to the nitty gritty, but at least at the high level. And maybe while they're not trying to talk about getting down to the specific cent on every account, the non-CFO partner might be interested in talking about your goals. Hey, we talked about going on this big vacation next year. Are we still on track for that? And then as a CFO, you're in a good position to be like, yeah, our savings has been doing really well. We're on our way to do that. And then if you're sort of the non-CFO, like I totally get it. People either don't like discussing money or it makes them feel uncomfortable. So trying to shape the conversation in a way that at least makes you aware, because again, you don't want to end up in that point where it's 10 years down the line and I have no idea how much money we have or where it's located. So, so being engaged and engaging on the areas that are of interest to you might be a good way to help keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Why don't we pivot and maybe talk about some of the tools that our audience could use to engage in these conversations and just like financial management within a joint circumstance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a few different areas. You're probably familiar with a lot of the sort of wealth trackers that are there that will help you. You can load up all your accounts to it, so you can see your checking account, your savings account, investment account, loan balances in there. And both partners can share in that, so you always have that update on your phone, knowing where different balances are. On the budgeting side, you also have a lot of budget tracking tools that can help you track your expenses. So, you'll connect your credit cards, your debit cards to it, and it'll ingest all of the transactions, and then you can categorize them. That can be an easy way to do that, monthly or quarterly check-in, as it were. So looking at your balances, looking at those expenses. Did we spend more than we expected to, less than we expected to? Thinking about analyzing if your money is reflected with your, the way you're spending reflects your values and what you find that's most important to you as a couple. Those can, I'd say those two sets of tools can be helpful for not only tracking, but keeping the conversation going.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any favorite budgeting apps that maybe even you use personally? Can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, so I use YNAB personally. This is one, so some of these apps are free, some of them are paid. This is a paid one. I think it's about $100 a year or so. I find it really good for expense tracking. Like I said, you can connect all of your checking and savings accounts into it, put the expenses in the different categories that you want, and it gives you a good picture to see if you're on track to your goals. And, you'll get your income in there too. So seeing this month, did we spend more than we brought in, or hopefully vice versa, that you're bringing in more than you spent. And it's a good way to compare it over time. This year, how did our spending look this year compared to last year? So that's one that's been very helpful for me. How about yourself? Do you use any of the wealth tracking ones, the account balance?
The only app that I use is Projection Lab, and I bought a lifetime membership to that right before they more than doubled the lifetime cost. So I was very grateful for that. But that's, I'd say, probably a bit denser than our typical audience would do. That's more of someone who's pretend financial advisor, really, really loves this stuff or is on the path to financial independence, retiring early. So Projection Lab is what I use, but I am the old school girly who uses Excel. It is intense. In June of 2018, I set out to actually track everything that I spend. And now I feel like it's been 7 years and I'm I can't stop, because now if I stop, then I've broken the streak. But I honestly, I've heard great things about YNAB and I feel slightly inclined to use it, but then I'm it's $100 that I don't need to spend because what I'm doing works. And I don't know whether or not I'd save a lot of time doing it. I know that the investment of learning the software on the front end is maybe a little bit heavy, but not, unmanageable. But that's my complicated answer. I use Excel. I wonder at times if I should actually get with the program and try out YNAB, because I know a lot of our students are referred towards that as well.
Mhm.
And it's a pretty user-friendly software, and it makes beautiful charts. And my Excel sheet looks much more trashy than that, but it works for me. So that's what I've used all these years.
Yeah, yeah. And I should say there's different levels of depth you can go into a tool like YNAB. So I primarily use it for this expense tracking, which maybe is like level 1. Level 2, though, is actually setting a budget and then assigning your income to different budget buckets. So, for example, especially if, maybe you want to make sure that you're only spending $200 on eating out a month, like that'll hold you to it because you're moving your money into that bucket, and you're like, oh, okay, we only have $20 left, and there's 2 weeks left in the month. Well, we better cut back. So
Right.
there's different levels of that too. But I like Excel. I use Excel for a bunch of stuff too.
Yeah. I like Projection Lab, not for anything. I don't even know that they offer anything expense tracking wise, but it's more of like retirement planning.
Yes, I used it too. It's a very good consumer facing. There are very few consumer facing financial planning softwares out there, and that's one of them. And it's great. I really like it too.
Yeah, I was just happy to find something consumer facing that actually does the Monte Carlo analysis, or they call it chance of success, but
Yeah.
it's very nice.
Like a preview for a future episode, maybe we'll have to talk about.
Hey, I would be happy to talk about Projection Lab. Kyle, the founder of that company, is very accessible. We might even be able to get him on.
Oh, that's fine.
I could try.
I was going to ask you though. So, I mean, I feel like there's going to be a lot of our listeners today are being like, okay, they've talked about all these options, but you guys, seem to be the experts. What do you do with your partner? I don't know. Do you want to? I'm happy to talk about what we do in terms of jointness and separateness. Do you
Let's
want to
start
talk
with
about
you,
that?
and then I'll go after that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, in thinking about this, so my wife and I, we think of our money as joint. So, we talked about this before we got married. We're going to think of this as sort of one big pool of money. And so, but with that, we've, elected not, we actually don't have any joint checking account at all. I have my own checking account. She has her own checking account. And part of this was sort of for convenience reasons, in the sense that, I didn't want to get in a situation where you're keeping enough money in the account that you might overdraft it, and who's taking what money out of it. So in this way, she has her checking account. She sets her bills up for auto pay. It goes in. We do that. I do the same thing in mine. I have mine, so my credit card bills and things like that come out of it. So at different times, one of us has paid the mortgage or the rent from our checking account. The other ones paid other bills. We have kids nowadays. The daycare bill is even more than the housing bill as it is. So, we've had to adjust for that as well. We have a joint investment account, but then we also have our separate retirement accounts. So it's, in some ways, it's really nice in that it is fairly low stress because we each have our own separate money that's in our accounts, which is good that way. We're not sort of we did the way I sort of said before, if this expense is under a certain amount, that we don't have to ask the other one. So we're not, eyeing every single thing quite as much. So that's turned out to work for us.
Great.
How about from your side?
So, as I said, I think we have literally done like every version of this. I would say right now I'm 30. And when I was maybe 25, I think we started getting to the point where we wanted to try to view it a little bit more separately. And I would probably identify myself as the CFO of my household.
Uh-huh.
So we still had access to being able to like view each other's account balances and transactions and stuff,
Uh-huh.
just from a convenience standpoint. But I was finding it so hard to like separate things out and make it like equitable and like shuffle money this way. And it just like it was so tedious.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, I don't think it ended up actually making either one of us happier. And because we got married young, we kind of started from a combined place.
Mm-hmm.
So after sort of swinging to the opposite end and being like, this doesn't feel like we're working towards a common goal as easily. And we're being like more protective about our money, and it didn't feel good to either of us. So we really tried, and it just didn't feel right for our relationship. So I want to say maybe 27 or 28, we decided, we're in it for the long haul. We knew that, but like we're ready to merge and figure out a way to still give us that feeling of independence, which is really what we ultimately were craving, was that like that money that is ours, that you don't get to tell me what to do with. And what I described earlier in the episode with that is kind of how we handle that. But now, especially with babies, we were very joint, and we just have the only independent piece of that is really our own personal savings, which is earmarked as we get to spend this money how we want to. And as I said, if we have extra money throughout the year and one of us or both of us see that account is maybe lower and we want to buff it up a little bit, we can kind of equally split out and maybe send a few $100 to each account so that we can buff that money back up as like a personal discretionary, spend this money however you want to kind of account. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else to mention on that front. I would say I feel like this version is working really well for us, and I view it as probably our long-term solution, and it also feels very simple from the perspective of financial planning. And as far as like retirement goes, I know we talked earlier about the IRA thing. We always are very intentional about contributing a set percentage of our income into accounts that are earmarked as our accounts. We don't have any like joint brokerage accounts because we are not maxing every other available personal account. Before that, I know that is an option for people who want to use a tax advantaged account. Or I don't know that what I just said makes sense, but if you've already maxed out all of your tax advantaged accounts, you might choose to do a brokerage account that's joint. We're not in that place, but some people might be. And I hope that answers the question and makes sense. I think I just rambled a little bit.
No, but I think that was a really good example of what we were saying, is that it could change over time. When you have this initial conversation, maybe you're on the, in getting engaged or about to get married, you're not making a decision for life necessarily. A couple years in, if it's not working out for you, accounts can be closed, accounts can be opened, you can change things around. So, maybe some listeners here have been married for a while already, and you're thinking to yourself, maybe this isn't exactly what I want to do, or maybe there's a different way. Could be an opportunity to open up the conversation with your partner and be like, hey, what if we tried being a little more joint, less joint, whatever, some of the options, separate, one joint account, separate accounts, as it were. As I said, there's no one right solution for everyone who's out there. So keeping that communication open and making changes when necessary, I think could be a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. Well put. I know we mentioned Ramit Sethi earlier. I would love to talk about his book briefly, maybe as a potential tool for people who are navigating this conversation as a couple. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. He's an author, podcaster. He has a Netflix show, I think. And so he's written a book called Money for Couples, which I think does a good job of introducing some of these conversations, questions to ask your partner, as well as setting up a potential system for handling your finances as a couple. He's very big into automation. And so, for example, having your paychecks automatically go into a joint account that every month sends money into your separate accounts that auto pays your bills, things like that. So you don't have to touch it. So if you're the kind of person who wants to be very hands off with it, that design could really work with you, because there's a lot of automations in there, but other people might want to be a little more hands-on. So I think that book is a really good potential resource for getting the conversation started and understanding what types of questions to ask and conversations to have with your partner.
Yeah, and it's his second book. His first one that he wrote was called I Will Teach You to Be Rich. And I believe his Netflix show was called How to Be Rich or something like that.
Something along those lines. Yes.
It was a fun show. I recommend it. If you have Netflix, check it out. Kind of dip your toes into the world of Ramit's perspective. If you ever hear me say how you live your rich life, that's definitely something I think he popularized in recent years. I really love his work, and he makes great resources. So thanks for bringing that up, and definitely encourage you as our listeners to check that book out. So, as we said, this conversation evolves. It can change. You don't have to do the same thing 3 years from now that you're doing today. You got to figure out what works best for you. And it's most important as a couple to build your financial foundation on trust and communication and openness. I hope that today's conversation has been helpful for our listeners. Do you have anything else you want to add today, Adam, before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate the conversation, Nikita, and hopefully listeners, I think the biggest thing is just to take that first step, opening up the lines of communication with your partner and getting the conversation going. Again, it doesn't have to start with laying your spreadsheets on the table. It can just start with talking about your experiences with money, talking about your money goals. That can be a good way to sort of get the ball rolling to better communication as a couple.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, thank you for coming on. And if you listened to this episode and got something out of it today, I encourage you to share it with a friend. And as always, please check our show notes. We will share everything that we've talked about today and maybe a little bit more as far as like a step-by-step guide of like how to have one of these money conversations and how to approach this conversation in a relationship. So thank you, Adam.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Nikita.
Thank you for joining us on the Third Decade Podcast. Remember, building your financial future isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about empowering yourself to live the life you want. If today's episode gave you new insights or inspired you to take action, we'd love for you to share it with someone who could benefit. Together, we can turn financial uncertainty into opportunity. Until next time, let's continue to embrace the journey ahead and take control of your financial future.